Good evening. My name is Tegan Kehoe, and I'm the Research and Adult Program Director at the Paul Revere House. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's program, which is part of our 2024 Lowell Lecture Series. One of the many unanswered questions historians have about Paul Revere is, how did he get so good at riding a horse? And we get asked, what was the name of Paul Revere's horse, so often that it's the title of our book of frequently asked questions. He didn't own a horse at the time of the Revolution, but the horse that he borrowed for the midnight ride may have been named Brown Beauty, if she had a name at all. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, is not here to settle these questions once and for all, but I hope that she'll help us better understand the kinds of questions that people who actually study the history of horses try to answer with their research. Dr. Carrington-Farmer is a professor of history at Roger Williams University, and she specializes in early American history. She received her PhD from the University of Cambridge, and she has published biographies of Thomas Morton and Roger Williams in edited collections. She has a forthcoming book, Roger Williams and His World, coming out in January with Broadview Press, and a recent article on Mary Williams in the New England Quarterly. The reason we asked her here tonight is that she also has expertise in equine history in the early modern Atlantic world. Her research examines the breeding and export of horses from New England to the West Indies and South America, and its intersection with enslaved lives and labor. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters on the topic, she has a book manuscript in progress, which received a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium research grant. It's tentatively titled Equine Atlantic, New England's 18th Century Horse Trade to the West Indies. Charlotte's talk this evening, The Narragansett Pacer, the Finest Riding Horse in 18th Century New England, will introduce us to the first truly American horse breed, why it was in high demand all around the Atlantic world, and why it eventually became extinct. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. If you're watching the program live, please feel free to add questions and comments in the YouTube chat. A staff member is monitoring them, and we'll have a quick Q&A portion at the end. Our next lecture in this series will be a hybrid program at Suffolk University and online, and it will take place on December 10th to tie in with the 250th anniversary of the capture of Fort William and Mary in New Hampshire. Thank you very much to Frederic and the GBH team for your live streaming support for tonight and the whole series, and to the Lowell Institute for funding the series. I'd also like to thank our partners for this year's lectures: the Suffolk University History Department, Milton Historical Society, Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, the Francis Tavern Museum in New York, and the Portsmouth Athenaeum. And thank you to Charlotte for joining us. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be here with you all this evening. Bear with me one second when I go ahead and share my screen. So, it's such a joy to be with you. As you heard from Tegan, I have a real interest in equine history, and I want to start by telling you a little bit about how I came to this particular project. I'm originally from the UK. I moved to Rhode Island 12 years ago. And when I moved, I flew my own horse across the Atlantic. And I thought, wow, that was a little bit dangerous and expensive. How did people move horses in the 17th and 18th century? This coincided with talking to a colleague who made a throwaway comment that has subsequently defined my research. They said, you should look into the Narragansett Pacer. Now you live in Rhode Island and you're looking for a new project. And I thought, never heard of a Narragansett Pacer. What is this horse? And so thus started my love affair with equine history, and specifically the Narragansett Pacer. The colleague who told me about the Narragansett Pacer again made quite a throwaway comment that Paul Revere may have ridden one on his famous midnight ride, and I set about trying to figure out what this horse was and if indeed that was true. So these are some of the things that I want to talk to you about in the next 45 or 50 minutes. Did Paul Revere actually ride a Narragansett Pacer? And then after we've talked a little bit about the specifics of Revere, I want to then go back and talk about where this breed came from, its 17th century origins. I then want to talk a little bit about what made Narragansett Pacers so special. I'll then talk a bit about the exportation of Narragansett Pacers from New England to the West Indies in particular, and then its eventual extinction into the 19th century. And then I'll wrap up with a little bit about some of the other famous people who rode these incredible horses. So I want to kind of start with what this series is not about, right? Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. And as Tegan says, that's one of the questions I know they get here all the time. And I know because I asked that many, many years ago when I came here for the first time as a tourist, with no interest in equine history at the time, just a genuine curiosity. So I want to think a little bit about that Midnight Ride. It's captured the public imagination in so many different ways, right? From historic reenactments to poems, to all kinds of artistic interpretations. And when Revere made this famous ride in 1775, I feel like it's captured artistic imagination in so many incredible ways. And so when Revere made this ride, to warn of British troops' arrival, he was initially, as Tegan said, rode across the Charles River to Charleston, and then at that point he takes off upon a horse owned by John Larkin. He eventually arrives around midnight, and I think what really inspired me to think about, did he ride an Narragansett Pacer on this ride, is what's left of the surviving sources. And so whilst it makes perfect sense for this midnight ride that Revere would select a pacer in terms of the time period, the mid to late 18th century, and its location, New England, and the type of journey, the sources that survive suggest potentially otherwise. And again, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes on this before we dive into his other rides, but I think, I'm sure that will be a question that people would have. So Revere himself provided 3 accounts of this famous ride. And although he stated he borrowed the horse from John Larkin, neither he nor anyone else took particular notice of the mount. I feel like they had other things on their mind at the time. So when Revere completed his ride, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress requested information from Revere. He provided 2 accounts, a draft and a corrected copy of the deposition, both dated at the time. But although it was written almost 23 years after the event, probably the most complete account of that particular ride is Revere's letter to Jeremy Belknap, the corresponding secretary of the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1798. And in this piece, which you see on the screen, he stated, "I saw 2 men on horseback. When I got near them, I discovered they were British. One tried to get ahead of me and the other to take me. I turned my horse very quick and galloped towards Charleston Neck." Now, a few things in this I think are worth considering, including the fact that he records that the horse galloped. And this is kind of flag number 1, that this horse is not necessarily a purebred Narragansett Pacer, because other contemporary accounts we'll talk about later on this evening describe how purebred Pacers did not gallop well. Later on in the account, Revere notes that it was a large horse, that the sergeant of the Grenadiers took the horse to replace his own smaller mount. And again, this is a red flag number 2, that this was not a purebred Narragansett Pacer, because again, as we'll see this evening, Narragansetts were small. They were almost a pony by today's standards. So I think for this famous ride, the height and the galloping indicators suggest that this was not probably a purebred Narragansett Pacer. What it is possible is that by the time Revere made this ride, New Englanders had been crossbreeding Narragansett Pacers with other horses, particularly Arabians, that could trot, pace, and gallop and were slightly bigger. So if he did ride any kind of pacer that night, it was probably some kind of crossbreed. Now, in Revere's other work, he rode several other important rides that are often overlooked, often needing to cover long distances, being as comfortable as possible, making good time. And I feel like on many of those journeys, it's very likely that he would indeed have selected a Narragansett Pacer for his work. Because as I'll see with you tonight, the Narragansett Pacer was indeed the number 1 choice for riding in New England and beyond in the 18th century. So another famous story where Narragansett Pacers do appear, this time is a work of fiction, The Last of the Mohegans. So when James Fenimore Cooper sat down to write The Last of the Mohegans, a narrative of 1757, in the mid-1820s, he made several important decisions about what people to cast, but also what horses to include. The novel, which describes Alice and Cora Monroe's journey across the northern part of New York to Fort William Henry, is set amid the 7 Years' War. Whilst Cooper's book, which was first published in 1826, is widely known, I think readers have paid little attention to the horses that are absolutely central to the plot. Now, Cooper selected a very particular kind of horse for this journey. He selected a Narragansett Pacer. So his decision to see Alice and Cora on this specific type of horse made perfect sense for a story about a long journey in the mid-18th century. Narragansett Pacers, which first appeared in Rhode Island in the 17th century, were renowned for their smooth and easy gait. In the novel, Alice's Narragansett Pacer was, quote, a sure-footed and peculiar horse. Its gait was between a trot and a walk, and it was fast yet easy, which made it the perfect mount for smooth long-distance travel. Pacers were able to cover up to 100 miles a day over rough roads without tiring the rider or themselves. So I feel like, again, Revere would have chosen this horse for many of his other rides. Narragansett Pacers were arguably the #1 choice of horse to ride on a long journey in America in the 18th century. So as you see on the PowerPoint, in The Last of the Mohegans, Uncas and Hawkeye discussed how Narragansett Pacers, quote, planted the legs of one side on the ground at the same time, which is contrary to the movements of all trotting four-footed animals of my knowledge. And yet here are horses that always journey in this manner, as my own eyes have seen. They continued, it's the merit of the animal. They come from the shores of Narragansett Bay in the small province of Providence Plantation and are celebrated for their hardihood and the ease of this peculiar movement, though other horses are not infrequently trained to the same. They concluded, this is a breed highly esteemed. So while this book is clearly a work of fiction, excuse me, it offers an incredibly accurate description of Narragansett Pacers. Which was echoed in contemporary horsemanship manuals, newspapers, account books, diaries, agricultural treatises, inventories, and countless other sources. As Tegan said, I was lucky enough to get a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grant that has allowed me to travel to archives all around New England, tracing equine history in the 18th century. I've also spent time in the UK in archives in Barbados and Jamaica. And what's become increasingly clear the more I dive into this is that Narragansett Pacers were a desirable and desired horse for long distance travel because of this unique pacing gait that was so aptly described in The Last of the Mohegans. So Narragansett Pacers originated in Narragansett Country in Rhode Island along the west bay of the colony from Wickford to Point Judith and westward to Charlestown. Here we go. I just want to show you here, actually, before we talk about this. This is an unknown image of a Narragansett Pacer that is held at South County History Center in Rhode Island. In Last of the Mohegans, it describes the unique pacing gait, and this image shows it perfectly. You can see that the front right is forward, as is the back right, and the front left is back and the back left. Most horses, when they trot, would have the front right forward and then also the back right forward, and they would move like this. Narragansett Pacers would swing, and their same side legs would be forward at the same time, and that's what made them so smooth and comfortable to ride. As you can see on the PowerPoint, they were typically chestnut, which you would call sorrel, with some white markings on their legs and face. Narragansett Pacers typically stood no taller than 14 hands high, and the horses were measured from the lower part of the hoof, so kind of down here up to the withers, which is essentially the shoulders. And their smooth pacing gait was linked to the specific way that their backbone moved in a straight line in the air, and rather than swinging and inclining the rider from side to side. Throughout the 18th century, people from far and wide praised Rhode Island's horses. The market for trading in pacers extended beyond New England and the North American colonies. Pacers, like other types of horses, were shipped from New England to the West Indies, around the Caribbean, and into South America. Narragansett Pacers were both useful and important horses, but in many ways, their history remained shrouded in mystery. Where did they come from? If they're so special, who bred them? How did they breed them? And after such popularity in the 18th century, why were they on their way to extinction by the mid-19th? And I'll try to answer some of these questions and more with you this evening. So Francis Higginson first brought 13 horses to Massachusetts in 1629, and 60 more arrived with John Winthrop's fleet the following year. Other horses were added to the breeding pool throughout the 1630s, and horses quickly made their way to Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the other colonies as the 17th century progressed. By 1647, William Brenton and William Coddington realized that whilst horses were necessary for travel around New England, there was also money to be made in exporting horses to the burgeoning Caribbean sugar plantations. Horses were not normally used for draft work in New England due to the rough ground. They tended to use oxen, but they were ideal for draft work in the sugar colonies down in the Caribbean. Therefore, New Englanders bred distinct types of horses for specific jobs. Firstly, they raised draft horses solely for exportation to the sugar colonies to crush the cane in the mill. And secondly, they bred saddle horses, both for domestic riding and travel, but also with a market for exportation. So let's be clear, Narragansett Pacers were saddle horses for riding, not draft horses. Writing in 1660, Samuel Maverick observed how horses and cattle had not only changed the New England landscape, but how they were part of its growing trade. And I quote, as you see on the screen, "As for the southern part of New England, it is incredible what's been done there. In the year 1626 or thereabouts, there was not a neat beast, horse, or sheep in the country, and very few goats or hogs. And now it's a wonder to see the great herds of cattle belonging to every town, the great number of horses, many sent to Barbados and the other Caribbean islands." This was reinforced by John Hull a few years later, writing in 1672. Hull's plan reveals a goal to breed particular horses for specific jobs, for the coach, for saddle, and for draft work. Hull said, and I quote, "If we procure a very good breed of large and fair mares and stallions, and that no mongrel breed might come among them, we might have a very choice breed for coach, horses, saddle, and draft, and others in a few years, and might draw of considerable numbers and ship them for Barbados, Nevis, and other such parts of the Indies." So there's a real concerted effort as the 17th century progresses to introduce selective breeding into horses. One of the ways that they do that is restricting breeding, and also restricting where the horses are intermingling. What you can see on the screen is from Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. I spent several weeks in their archive there as part of my fellowship, and you can see one of the early branding records for Connecticut. So each individual town, it says, all horses are to be branded on the near shoulder, and these are the individual marks for each of the towns. So Windsor was the mark with an I. So by the end of the 17th century, New England's horse breeding industry had started to center in the Narragansett country on the west bay of Rhode Island and across the border into Connecticut. So this was known as Narragansett country, and we're over here on the west bay of Rhode Island. And again, if we zoom in here, this is where the horse breeding, the Narragansett Pacer, takes its name from, the indigenous nation who are still on their homelands today. This was an ideal area for horse raising due to its fertile, level, and well-watered pasture lands. The swamp grasses made excellent hay, and the saltwater ponds provided water and indeed natural fencing. The conditions were ideal for allowing for the Narragansett Pacer horse and other types of horses, including draft horses, to thrive. Rhode Island quickly gained fame in the second half of the 17th century as a horse breeding centre. Their horses were also used to start other equine breeding schemes. For example, Robert Kilvert sailed from New Amsterdam to buy horses in Rhode Island or Warwick for breeding in New Netherland, and Rhode Island horses were also transported to the Carolinas, Maryland, and beyond, where they were used as a foundation to pioneer breeding programs. So to think a little bit more then now about what made the Narragansett Pacer so special and so desirable as we hit the 18th century. As you see on the screen, the Reverend Dr. McSparran, who was a rector of the Narragansett Church from 1721 to 1759, described how Narragansett Pacers were, quote, remarkable for fleetness and swift pacing. McSparran had seen some of them pace a mile in little more than 2 minutes and a good deal less than 3. McSparran himself had upon the larger pacing horses rode 50, nay 60 miles a day, even in New England where the roads were rough, stony, and uneven. In 1711, Rip Van Dam of New York described the great lengths he went to acquire a Narragansett Pacer. When the horse was shipped from Rhode Island, it jumped overboard and swam back to return to shore. And when Van Dam finally got the horse, he wryly noted, quote, it always plays and acts and will never stand still. He will take a glass of wine, beer, or cider, and probably would drink a dram on a cold morning. This is a horse I like. And Van Dam acknowledged that even though the horse was so high prized, it was, quote, no beauty, and it was prized for its legs and comfortable gait. Now, several contemporary writers concurred, describing purebred Narragansett Pacers as, quote, villainously ugly. So all these accounts described that the Pacer was renowned for its utility, not its beauty. And one source described how they were, quote, a source of inordinate pride to their owners, despite their, quote, ugly sorrel color, broad back, short legs, and curious pace, which made them almost a caricature of a horse. So one of the sources that's been useful for this project is newspapers, such as this one from Newport, the Newport Mercury from 1765. The particular advert that you see on the screen is for a horse that was stolen, and it gives us a sense of the types of horses that were in New England in the 18th century. So it's a strayed or stolen from the point in Newport, the 30th day of October last. And this is how we see it's an Narragansett Pacer. It says it's a gelding horse of chestnut color, so the color matches, with a white blaze in his face, so very typical for Pacers. All 4 feet are white, again, very typical, is about 14 hands high, so exactly the right height for a pacer. And then it describes him as a natural pacer who goes remarkably easy. So again, we can see this is a really great 18th century description of a Narragansett pacer. In addition to newspapers, published accounts from the period and into the 19th century also extolled the superiority of the Narragansett Pacer as a saddle horse. What you see on the screen is from Robert Livingston writing in the first American edition of the American Encyclopedia, and he went over the top to describe the virtues of the Narragansett Pacer at length. And I quote, they have handsome foreheads, the head clean, the neck long, the arms and legs thin and taper, the hindquarters are narrow, and the hocks are sickle-hocked, which turns their hind feet out a little. So that's a conformation defect. Their color is generally, though not always, bright sorrel, so chestnut. They're very spirited and carry both head and tail high. But what is most remarkable is that they amble with more speed than most horses trot. So it's difficult to put some of them upon a gallop. These circumstances, together with their being very sure-footed, render them the finest saddle horses in the world. They neither fatigue themselves nor their rider. there are so many other accounts that concur with this. For example, writing in 1771, Richard Beringer's The History and Art of Horsemanship, Volume 1, explored the merits of different horse breeds at length. He was undoubtedly a knowledgeable horseman, and he observed, quote, that New England had a very peculiar sort of horse that naturally paces with great speed. He described how Narragansett Pacers moved with, quote, such safety and exactness, they are chiefly esteemed for possessing this talent, which they exert in a degree very superior to other horses. And whilst he noted that Narragansett Pacers were originally of English stock, he did not elaborate on exactly when and where the breed originated. This is because the specific origins of the Narragansett Pacer still remain unclear. In the early 19th century, the commonplace book of gentlemen, horses, and neat cattle concluded that, quote, the Narragansett was a peculiar breed, peculiar to New England. Moreover, whilst the origin was not certainly known, the book speculated that the Narragansett breed was probably introduced from England by our forefathers. So I spent some time working with other equine historians who work on equines in England in the 17th century and the different types of horses that were prevalent there. I've spent quite a bit of time looking at native breeds to England and Scotland and Ireland, looking at their different characteristics, looking at the types of horses that were most likely shipped in the 17th century that subsequently probably influenced the Narragansett Pacer. And there are several examples that come through. I'll come back to that in a second. One example is the Irish Hobby. Another example is the Scottish Galloway. These two are small native breeds from England. Again, when you read the descriptions, they sound like Narragansett Pacers, small, hardy, comfortable ponies, probably crossbred with a Spanish Genet, which you see kind of on the screen here. All of which were pretty common in early modern England. So it's probably a mix of these breeds that creates the Narragansett Pacer. The breed probably evolved further in the late 17th and into the 18th century in Rhode Island when Thomas Hazard introduced a stallion that we can track in the records called Old Snip to the breeding pool. And proving lineage to Old Snip becomes a really common thing as the 18th century progresses. Again, it's not certain when or how Hazard acquired Old Snip the stallion, and there were so many incredible stories. Some suggest that he found him wandering out near Point Judith. Some suggested he was imported. Some are like suggest that he just washed up at sea. So there's all this kind of mystery around Old Snip. But regardless, proving lineage to Old Snip proved important. And by the turn of the 18th century, the Narragansett Pacer was not only established, but targeted breeding programs had begun to flourish. I've been looking to spend some time out in Kentucky at the International Museum of the Horse. And one of the sources that I spent some time there reading are horsemanship manuals that describe illnesses that horses faced in the 18th century. And I just wanted to share one of these with you that gives you a sense of how horses were cared for in the 18th century. And you can see this particular horse is labeled all over its body with all the things that can go wrong. Under its stomach is a line saying colic. That's basically a potentially deadly illness that affects horses. I say this because my own horses had colic surgery twice. Also, it's labeled with strangle. So if anyone's interested in like caring for horses and horsemanship manuals, I can happily talk about that more later on this evening. So horse raising rapidly expanded in Narragansett country and in Connecticut and also in Massachusetts as the 18th century progresses. And recovering details on how New Englanders bred horses, specifically Narragansett Pacers, is easier said than done at times. When breeders passed away, most of their estate inventories simply listed the number of horses that they owned. For example, Ichabod Potter's estate inventory from 1738 is rare in the fact that it specifically mentions one small white pacing horse valued at £6. And estate inventories from New England tend to simply list the number and gender of the horses. For example, when Roland Robinson passed away in 1716, his estate in Narragansett country simply listed 64 horses, mares, and colts. In contrast, I found newspapers to be particularly fruitful for information on breeding horses. Newspaper advertisements for breeding Narragansett Pacers and also for exporting them have revealed the natural pacing ability of this horse, the height, its agility, its pedigree, its color, and how they were central to classifying this type of horse. The newspaper advertisements, as I'll show you a few examples in a second, describe at length the pacing ability, the suitability for riding, and the importance of claiming lineage to Old Snip. So here's an example from 1744. I want to give two examples. I want to talk to you about this horse that I followed through the record, who's called the Peacock. And then afterwards, I'll share a story of another horse called Smiling Ball. So I started following Peacock through the record. So Peacock was the property of Ichabod Potter of Rhode Island, and Potter ran several adverts for Peacock throughout the 1770s. So this was a pacer horse that was going to be breeding. So he says that the horse will cover at $4 a season. So basically people could spend $4 to send their mares to come and breed with this horse based in Newport. But the most important bit of this advert is the second bit at the bottom. It describes the Narragansett Pacer, the Peacock, in great detail. It says, the Peacock is the grandson of the famous Will Dare, got by the beautiful horse Bishop out of a fine Narragansett mare, equal to any in America. He's not exceeded in carriage and behavior by any horse whatsoever. And then it describes the terms for the breeding. So this is 1744. I just want to check, through. So Peacock appears in the newspapers in 1792. So, almost, 2 decades later. So I was like, what's going on? Like, that's a really old horse, the same horse. So you can see here then, it says the famous Narragansett pacing horse, which was formerly owned and raised by Governor Potter of Rhode Island. So seems like it could be the other horse, right? Is now owned by William Hyde of Lebanon. So it's moved to Connecticut. And it describes the, breeding requirements, how much people could pay to have their mare come and to breed with this stallion. But again, the second bit of the advert describes this horse. It says his size is good, his color is bright chestnut, his courage and carriage none will exceed, and is supposed to be as good a saddle horse of that breed as ever was in America. He's 5 years old this spring. And I was like, well, that can't be the same one. So my guess is that this Peacock is a descendant of the previous Peacock. And again, I was tracing this particular Peacock through the records. And so we see that Peacock appears again, in the newspapers, describing the famous horse called the Peacock. And then this advert confused me. It says he's half English and half of the Narragansett breed. So what that means is he's likely half thoroughbred and half a Narragansett Pacer. So he's been a crossbreed, okay? So as we'll see a little bit later this evening, crossbreeding becomes prevalent as the 18th century progresses, particularly with thoroughbreds and also with Arabians. It produces a much more versatile horse and often a better looking horse. And if you read this advert, it describes he's 4 years old, well built, he trots and paces. So again, trotting is where the front right will be forward and the back left, and then they'll switch. Paces is where both the front and back right will be there. So this horse can do both of these. And it describes, as for his beauty, strength, and activity, he will recommend himself. So crossbreeding, I think, leads to part of the reason why these purebred pacers wane as we hit the 19th century. The second case study I want to share with you this evening is Smiling Ball. So this advert, again from the Newport Mercury from 1765, describes the Smiling Ball, formerly known by the name of the Robinson horse. now owned by the subscriber, so Henry Gardner, held in Newport. And again, it describes the terms for the breeding. You can pay $2 each leap. This is my favorite bit, though. It says, this horse is so well known that it's needless to give any recommendation of him. And as I've not owned him long, shall only say a little of what may be in truth be said of him. He is without exception as well limbed, as good a size, colour, carriage, and breed as any in New England. Any person who sees the said horse, I flatter myself, cannot be but well pleased with him. I was like, okay, sounds like a good horse. So I wanted to trace smiling breed through the papers. So again, we see this switch from a Rhode Island story to Connecticut. And again, that tracks with a lot of the other horse breeding as the 18th century progresses. So in this advert, Smiling Bull is described as a Narragansett horse of the old snip breed. So again, proving lineage, called Smiling Bull, just bought 150 miles from the eastward. So just come here. And again, it describes the terms of the breeding, but again, to have a look at the description of this type of horse. So it said the horse is a chestnut sorrel, 15 hands high. It paces exceedingly fast and easy, but it also trots fast. So maybe there's some crossbreeding going on here. Will easily travel 80 miles a day without tiring himself or the rider. His colts make excellent easy saddle horses. So again, this seems like a really good example of some horse that has Narragansett Pacer breeding in it. Just a couple more examples. So again, this describes Smiling Bull. It says here that has found and purchased a Narragansett horse of the true genuine snip breed, called Smiling Bull, 15 hands high, dark chestnut color, trots square and single, canters easy, and I cannot learn that he was ever beat in pacing. So again, we see these descriptions that suggest that whilst this horse has true, genuine Narragansett Pacer, there may have been some crossbreeding going on here. And again, Smiling Bull pops up again, this time in 1788. Again, I just want to focus on this section here, not the way that the breeding is, but it says the horse is supposed to be the swiftest pacer in America and never was beat. Trots fast and easy, is 15 hands high, of a dark chestnut color, and a very sure horse for colt. So we get this sense from the newspapers then that by the 18th century, we do see some crossbreeding going on. Which again tracks with the requirements for horses as the 18th century progresses. So the success of New England's horse breeding industry was directly linked to the labor of enslaved peoples. Enslaved Africans trained in animal husbandry toiled alongside indigenous people, servants, and wage laborers, breeding and raising and training horses on plantations around New England. Enslaved peoples, like horses, could be traded at will, and the language used to describe enslaved people and horses was strikingly similar. When planters died, their human and non-human animal property was regularly listed together. Now, what you see on this image, this is from South County History Center in Rhode Island, are, again, the two types of horses that were exported. So the man here is riding a Narragansett Pacer. It really matches the description. And the enslaved man here is clearly handling a Narragansett Pacer. But this third horse is the other type of horse that was exported from New England in the 18th century, a heavier set draft horse. And this is the type of horse that was also exported down to the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations. You can see here then, as I say, the newspapers are ripe with advertisements for enslaved peoples trained in animal husbandry. So it would quite often be enslaved peoples who were in charge of raising these animals on the plantations. And you can see again from some of the other archival records, this comes from Newport Historical Society, that the Redwood Plantation in Antigua listed enslaved peoples here right alongside their non-human animals here. And it's this really uncomfortable truth in doing this particular history. We can also see sources such as this from the John Carter Brown Library. The Brown family in the 18th century were leading exporters of horses, particularly to the Dutch colony of Suriname. This particular letter is a purchase agreement between Nicholas Brown and Company and Isaac Tripp. And you can see here they're purchasing 40 horses that are in good case fit for the Suriname market. And they propose to pay for these horses in rum, sugar, molasses, and quote, one Negro girl. So we're seeing horses and humans being directly traded. So in addition to riding horses such as Narragansett Pacers being exported to the West Indies, draft horses were also exported down to the West Indies. And we can see an example of one of the jobs that draft horses did on the sugar plantations, turning the sugar wheels again, working alongside enslaved peoples. We also have some really great images from the West Indies that do show Narragansett Pacers. So we can see here, the woman is riding side saddle, but this horse is clearly, it looks to be in terms of color, a Narragansett Pacer. And, the gait is interesting too. You see also for this horse, these feet it's just really interesting to think about how these are shown. And what's interesting about this particular image is this particular formation is called master horse slave, and enslaved peoples would lead the horses and then hold on to their tails to follow them through. So really problematic imagery here. So one of the things that I've been looking at is this export business. And on the screen, you can see one of the many export records documenting the horses, mules, and other animals that were raised in New England and then exported to the West Indies. I spent a lot of time in the archives at Mystic Seaport reading ship logbooks, such as the one that you see on the screen, which describes the passage across the Atlantic in graphic and at times gory details. The horses were held on deck, so they didn't travel below deck. They were on the deck in a temporary stable. And on top of the deck, they would put an awning that was temporary. And on the awning would be hay and water. So anytime they hit bad weather, the food and the water would be the first thing to go overboard. And then there's these graphic accounts of horses falling through the deck, horses drowning, horses getting really sick. And again, if anyone's interested in the export of horses, I absolutely can talk more about this in the Q&A. In addition to ship logbooks, one of the really interesting resources for tracing the export of Narragansett Pacers and draft horses from New England are insurance records. And you can see an example from Connecticut here. So horses, like other cargo, were insured. And what's interesting is a lot of the times the Narragansett Pacer horses, the riding horses, seem to be insured at a higher value than the draft horse, which suggests that there was they were more valuable, right? The draft horses could easily be replaced. So I want to talk a little bit about the decline and then finish with some famous rides. So throughout the 18th century, Rhode Island and then later Connecticut became the absolute epicenter of breeding and exportation of horses. After the Revolutionary War and the British occupation of Rhode Island, the fortunes of the Narragansett Pacer started to decline. J.P. Hazard lamented that one of the causes of that loss of that famous breed, the Narragansett Pacer, was the great demand for it in the sugar colonies, particularly in Cuba, when the island began to cultivate sugar extensively. He argued that Cuba's sugar plantation industry, as that expanded, planters wanted pacing horses for themselves and their wives and their daughters to ride faster than New England could supply them. He acknowledged that because the breed was solely a riding horse, it was not suitable for draft or carriage work, and it was not as versatile as other horses. Exploitation certainly played a part in the decline, but so too did other factors, including travel innovations in New England. As roads improved around New England during the 18th century, travel by saddle decreased and rides by carriage became more common. As early as the 1760s, New Englanders sought a more versatile horse. Horses that could both trot and pace, that might also be able to go under saddle, but also in a carriage. And due to their unique backbone movement, which made them so desirable under saddle, pure Narragansett Pacers were not suitable as carriage horses. Now, what you see on the screen is an advert from the Newport Mercury that as early as 1763, there's a fear in the colony that exporting is dwindling the stock of horses. So as early as 1763, merchant farmers and breeders around New England sought to revive an interest in breeding pacers through hosting a race with a sizable purse. The following advert appeared in the Newport Mercury. It says, whereas the best horses of this colony have been sent off from time to the West Indies and elsewhere, by which the breed is much dwindled, to the great detriment of both merchant and farmer. Therefore, a number of public-spirited gentlemen of Newport, for the good of the colony, and to encourage farmers to breed better horses for the future, have collected a purse of $100 to be run on Thursday, the 5th of May next, on Easton's Beach, free for any horse, mare, or gelding bred in the colony. Proper certificate of the place where the horses were bred to be produced under the hands of the breeder at the time of the entrance. So this call for entries openly addressed how the breed was much dwindled and how the best horses had been sent to the West Indies and elsewhere. By the late 18th century, the neighboring colony of Connecticut had started to emerge as the leading breeder of Narragansett Pacers. Now, this race then, disappointingly, only had a handful of entries. It had 3 starters, and when Samuel Gardner of South Kingston won, it must have felt like a hollow victory. The breed continued in Connecticut into the early 19th century, and by 1820, when Charles Henry Hall addressed the Wyndham Society of Agriculture, he lamented, quote, "There was a time when New England could boast of a race of horses equal in most respects to those of any country. The true Narragansett horse was a noble animal which had been lost by want of care and circumstance." Hall blamed crossbreeding too many Narragansett Pacers with Arabian stallions in the 17th century, and thus, quote, "finally by degrees, one by one, the whole race disappeared, not leaving a solitary crossblood to procure the species." Other sources suggest that by the mid-19th century, there was maybe 1, maybe 2 Narragansett Pacers left in the colony. We know throughout the early 19th century, breeders around New England tried various measures to attempt to revive the bloodline. And we know that in Connecticut, Sachem and Narragansett Pacer stood for stud in the early to mid 18th century. They quoted in the advert they were sought to revive the most valuable breed of horse, so esteemed for their extraordinary performance under saddle. The breeders were so keen to restore the Narragansett Pacer to its former glory, they were willing to incur a loss. Sadly, these efforts failed, and by the mid-19th century, the breed was on its way to extinction. Now, the final story that I want to tell in the last minute or so before we take questions is about George Washington. So George Washington was not only a keen horseman, but he too owned and raced Narragansett Pacers. His diary records several times when he enters his horses in a pacing race. Washington corresponded with Connecticut horse breeder Jeremiah Wadsworth, who was a notable breeder and trader of Narragansett Pacers in the 18th century. Washington was one of Wadsworth's most notable clients, and the 2 men corresponded at length about horses. Wadsworth wrote to Washington in 1796 to describe an 8-year-old black gelding that he'd recently purchased for Washington. He said the horse was, quote, a good pacer who can pace both fast and slow. However, with purebred pacers, his trot was not so good. And in line with other contemporary accounts, Wadsworth warned George Washington, quote, that the horse was no beauty. He said, I wish I could say he was handsome, but that rarely belongs to this breed. But he carries well and when moving has a decent appearance. Wadsworth paid $130 for the horse and planned to send the horse to Washington. He ended the letter with an interesting promise to Washington. Quote, if we live 2 or 3 years, I hope to furnish you with a perfect Narragansett, as I have 2 fine mare colts, one of which, when old enough, you shall have. And I feel like this final line demonstrates that Narragansett Pacers continued to be bred and valued throughout the 18th century. And the fact that George Washington, along with other notable 18th century people, had an interest in acquiring perfect Narragansetts. The Narragansett Pacer has impacted various modern horse breeds. It was emerged in response to a specific set of circumstances, and when these circumstances changed in the 19th century, the breed faded out. Crossbreeding with Arabians and other horses contributed to the demise of the breed, but it also allowed new breeds to emerge. Through breeding with others, the Pacer has likely influenced other breeds, such as the Standardbred, the Canadian Pacer, the Kentucky Mountain Horse, the Saddlebred, potentially the Tennessee Walking Horse. So whilst the Pacer is gone, its legacy is not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. We're starting to get some questions from the audience already. So we have an audience member asking whether the French and Spanish brought horses to America during the American Revolution, and did the individual horses need to adapt to English commands or English-speaking riders when they were here?
That's such a good question. So, as Tegan said, I'm working on this book called Equine Atlantic, New England's Horse Trade to the West Indies. And one of the big parts of that book is all about horses and empire. So how essentially the British Empire, both in North America, but also in the Caribbean, is directly tied to those questions of supply and demand. And so I spent a lot of time looking at correspondence and records of the Houses of Parliament in London, and they spend so much time debating if the French or the Spanish could supply horses to the Caribbean colonies in a way that New England is able to dominate that trade. And so we do see that those the French and the Spanish are sending some of the horses down to the Caribbean, but it's not in a way that's enough to keep up with the demand for those draft horses and riding horses. And one of the things that as we hit the 18th century and as New Englanders, and start to want to kind of separate away from England, one of the things that I kind of had this epiphany was like, how is the horse trade tied to the American Revolution, right? Like we think about the Intolerable Acts and things like that. But as the 18th century progresses, the English Parliament puts various restrictions on New England's export of horses down to the Caribbean sugar colonies. They are trying to force New Englanders just to export those horses down to the English sugar colonies, Barbados, Jamaica. But New Englanders are really, I don't want to say like dodgy, but a little bit dodgy, right? Like they want to send the horses where they can get the best money. So, reading the ship logbooks and letters between various merchants, we can see that, they might say they're going to Barbados, but they're not, right? They're trading with the French islands. They're going to the Dutch colony of Suriname. And my book chapter will actually have a whole chunk on the Dutch colony of Suriname and how that empire ties into that. So I think in answer to that question, it would depend whether you were answering as a New England horse breeder, who'd be like, yeah, you can get the horses from wherever, or if you were answering from the British Parliament or a sugar plantation owner.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, this next question, I'm not sure whether the documentation exists on this, so I don't know whether you'll be able to answer. But did William Dawes or Samuel Prescott or any of the riders who were sort of the phone tree out from Revere and Dawes's rides, did any of them use Narragansett Pacers?
Yeah, you answered the question, right, Tegan? Like we don't have that documentation, certainly not to my knowledge. I think in that particular moment, all eyes are on what the goal is, right? Like I feel like that would be like today if someone's got some urgent message and they've got to get there and they're describing getting there and they spend like time describing the car they drove in, right? Like that's not what they're going to be focusing on. So a lot of the time, no, people aren't paying attention to the horses in those particular moments. But it's possible, it certainly is, right? Like these horses are useful for long distance, comfortable travel and can go long distance comfortably, smoothly, and quickly. So it's possible.
Mhm. That's great. And I think because these questions are coming in via chat, there's always a bit of a delay as people are typing out their questions. So I think those are the two questions we have at the moment. Yes.
And maybe,
Um,
do you have
oh, go
another
ahead.
question? No, go ahead.
We do have another question. First, the audience member wants to say well done and thank you. And then they ask, have you come across anything about how the Narragansett Pacers were shod, if they were shod, before they were shipped out? And this person says they know sometimes shoes were pulled before shipping.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's another scholar working on horseshoes. So if that person wants to contact me directly, I can connect them with the person who recently asked me that very same question. So that's really strange that two people are asking that. I've not looked at that particular issue. I've spent a lot of time looking, a lot of the merchant account books that I've looked at describe every single expense that they spend before shipping the horses. And I've not seen a reference to horses having their shoes pulled for the voyage. That being said, when my horse flew from England, they took her shoes off for the flight. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. The horses stood for the duration of the voyage. So it would make sense that they would do, adjust the shoe and maybe take them off if it's more comfortable. It saves money. But it's not something I've seen, but it's not something I've been particularly looking for. So if that person wants to send me an email, I can connect them with the same, like someone just asked me that question a few weeks ago.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And got another question coming in. Is the pacer seen in any modern breeds, although the breed itself is no longer here? They're asking about particularly the American Standard.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things that we do think that the breed lives on in other versions of the breed. That's one of several that we believe it's impacted with the particular way that it moves. The Narragansett Pacer was a natural pacing horse. It wasn't trained to do that. It was a natural thing. Again, we see that with some breeds of horses today too. So yeah, that's a really good example. And in fact, equine historians often have trouble saying that the Narragansett Pacer was a breed. Like that's one of the real big questions in equine history that, can we use that terminology as type a better word for that? So yeah, it definitely impacts later breeds. So
Great. And we have a kind of a follow-up question, although from a different person. With the prevalence of DNA testing for horses today, has there been any search for the genetics of pacers?
I love that question so much. Yeah, not specifically of pacers, but there've been a bunch of DNA work, particularly on horses in the Caribbean, that have linked ties back. I think that would be really cool to do. I think it would be particularly exciting to do that work maybe in Barbados or Jamaica to see if there's any left. So to answer the question, not specifically for the pacers, but there's been a bunch of DNA studies. And again, if that person wants to reach out to me, I can send them the link to those DNA studies.
And is the best way to contact you through the information on your university's website, or?
That's right. Yeah. If you Google Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, Roger Williams University, I'll be the person that pops up and my email is up there. It also describes some of the other work that I've done. I published an article called The Rise and Fall of the Narragansett Pacer in the Rhode Island History Journal in 2008. So I'm happy to share that. I've just published a book chapter on the export of mules, another book on the export of horses. So if anyone's interested in wider equine history, I'd be delighted to connect with them.
Great. Yeah. And I actually have a question, just, I was going to say putting my Paul Revere House hat on, but I never take it off, which is on some of his longer journeys when Revere is going to New York or Philadelphia, or Rhode Island. You mentioned that it's likely that he did ride a pacer. Can you tell us a little bit about, from your understanding of how this worked, what that horse's day would look like? How many hours would he be riding at a time? How many different horses are making this journey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Pacers can cover the accounts we see 40, 50, 60, maybe even more miles a day, um, covering that in reasonably quick time. So my sense is that if he's making those long journeys, he would very likely be using that because he's not just going for a mile or two, right? Like he's going for, 100 odd miles or whatever it might be. So my sense he would ride a pacer for several hours, maybe then switch horses onto another pacer, and then continue the ride. So from those descriptions of those rides and where he's going and when he's going, my sense is that it's very likely on many of those rides, it would have made sense. He's got a comfortable horse, he's going a long distance, that would be your choice for an 18th century saddle horse.
That's great. Um, so we have time for one last question. Um, this person, Henry Sarabo, says, "Hi, Dr. Carrington-Farmer from RWU students. Why do we associate the Narragansett Pacer with Paul Revere despite no primary sources that confirm this?"
Well, a bunch of secondary sources suggest, including Wikipedia, I checked it this afternoon as I was on the way here actually, suggest like hint that he could have done, right?
Mhm.
And that's been around for a while. My sense, as I said in the intro, is that for that particular midnight ride that everyone talks about, right? The way he describes the horse, he specifically uses that term gallop. So my sense is if he's got a pacer, it's a crossbreed. Um,
Mhm.
and the height of the horse, right? Like it seems like it's a bigger horse, again, just on the description. So if I would go out on a limb and say if he is riding a pacer on that, it's some type of crossbreed by this point in the 18th century. It's just a cool story, right? Like it'd be great if he had ridden one on that midnight ride. But again, like you say, we don't even know the name of the horse. People have speculated on all kinds of things. I think it's such an iconic moment in early American history, particularly the Revolutionary War. And we have this image of him that we have this famous New England horse, and people just tend to put two and two together and just haven't studied the pacer as a horse itself, to kind of understand that those two descriptions don't go together.
Got it. So iconic moment, people are trying to fit an iconic horse to
Yeah.
it.
We see it all the time.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been really informative and really interesting. And for those of you who are watching live, know that this recording will be at the same link that you've been watching live. So if you want to return to it, it will be available on the same channel. Thank you all so much, and thank you again for your lecture tonight.